Hello, and on behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, OneFuse Integration Platform, presented by Tracy Curran, SovLabs Director of Product Marketing, and David Coulter, SovLabs Chief Technology Officer. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your continued support in the global VMUG program. Before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You will receive an email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation. All questions will need to be entered in the question window near the bottom of your GoToWebinar screen. Third, there will be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session and what you might like to see going forward. All attendees from today's webcast who opted in at registration will be entered into a raffle to win a $100 Amazon gift card. The winner will be contacted directly by SovLabs, so good luck. All right, let's get started. Tracy, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Julie. David, you want to advance the slide? Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tracy Curran. I am the Director of Product Marketing here at SovLabs, now part of CloudBolt. Joining me today will be David Coulter. He's the co-founder and CTO of SovLabs, and we're going to take you through a brief overview of our new OneFuse platform. David, you want to? So for those of you that may be unfamiliar with SovLabs, we just wanted to give you some background. We were founded in 2015. We are backed by Insight Partners, which is a $30 billion private equity firm. We have 150 global enterprise client or customers and 10% of the Fortune 100. With the recent acquisition, we are now a leader in both integration solutions and cloud management, and we've received numerous industry awards and recognition from VMware, including Technical Partner of the Year, Cloud Management and Automation Partner of the Year, and we also hold 150 VMware certifications in both data center and automation. One of the things that we're particularly proud of is our high NPS scores. VRA customers consistently score us 3 times higher than industry average, which is a big accomplishment since automation is a tough space to achieve such high scores. So David, want to advance? All right, so this slide is an overview of our current capabilities in VRA 7. These are all available today as plugins. And the goal of our solutions is to really remove the need for custom development and instead offer a software-defined approach to integration. We want to reduce the complexity of infrastructure automation and help control the costs and resource overhead from these growing systems. So why did we create OneFuse? We can advance. So we did that because VRA is not the only automation platform in environments today. According to Gartner, there are at least 4 automation tools involved in enterprise provisioning, and that comes from a somewhat dated report. Our customer experience says that number is probably much higher, and bringing these systems together is still a challenge. So it's a challenge to develop custom code to integrate them, and it's a challenge and it's expensive to maintain them. So in addition to the 200% increase in maintenance costs over time, having heavily customized environments leads to a lot of complexity, and that complexity makes governance and compliance particularly difficult. So all of this leads to a lot of wasted resources and wasted costs. So we created OneFuse to really address that so that we can continue to offer great capabilities to our VRA customers, but also extend that to other platform users like Terraform. So with that, David, you want to take it from here, go a little deeper for us?
Yeah, appreciate that. All right, so thanks, Tracy. So yeah, David Coulter, CTO of SovLabs, now part of CloudBolt. So as Tracy mentioned, we have a long-standing history of solving these deep, technology and integration challenges for customers. But one thing we've seen from the market as well as from customers and being on these, hundreds of projects over time is that there's really no single platform, monolithic platform out there that provides that 100% automation coverage out of the box, right? And there's overlapping tools and capabilities, as Tracy mentioned, depending on which team is driving it and where the automation is coming from. There's a lot of different tools and capabilities there. And also the teams themselves, there's different specializations, infrastructure management responsibilities, different tools that the teams use, and an overwhelming need and desire to improve the security posture from an integration standpoint, compliance, governance, visibility. Those things are critical as you start to scale, and try to figure out the technology integrations between the systems. And then lastly, what we're seeing is, the out-of-the-box functionality of a lot of the automation platforms is pretty limited and does require a customization. So that leads customers down, custom development, and more customization for meeting their process and operational standards, which can lead to vendor lock-in, technical debt, increased management overhead, project delays, budget issues. So it's a nascent issue, but it's definitely out there, and we're seeing this cause struggle within companies over time. So looking at it from the perspective of the tools and the integrations, there, like I said, depending on what tool is driving the automation, there's really a cross-stitch pattern that starts to emerge. Of who's driving the automation, and then what are the endpoints in the downstream automation tools, platforms, infrastructure components that require automation as part of that IT tool chain. And this is really where the problem area is. It's difficult to enforce any kind of governance or controls in this middle area. It's kind of defined within the tool set that you're using. And if that's scripts, that's even more loose, right? So what that roadblocks and some issues that can happen from this is what happens when IT decides to switch tools, going from one vendor to another on the back-end tools, such as IPAM, DNS, and some of those tools. What happens when those versions change? What does that do to the support and user experience across the vendors when you need help and you have trouble from an integration standpoint? And then operationally and scaling, there's a duplication of integration effort. If you're using different tools from different teams or different scenarios, you end up with these pockets of glue code a lot of times, or centralized or lack of that centralized policy, right, of how do I do this consistently between the different areas. And the problem doesn't stop there. It's also a team problem, right? So you have multiple different teams that may be managing these different tool sets or maybe consuming them. So there's some security impact challenges there as well. So who manages the technology? Who consumes it? What happens when those teams need to consume each other's services? What does least privilege, separation of concerns look like? Where do you start to troubleshoot things when there's an outage? Who's responsible? So all these are challenges for customers as they start to scale automation, and just pockets of automation emerge throughout the enterprise, and there's no real kind of top-down connectivity mesh in between this. So enter the OneFuse integration platform, where we've been focusing our time and energy, is providing this integration services layer with modular capabilities, back to the independent endpoints, and exposing those use cases and scenarios in the form of policies. So a policy basically describes how I want to handle things from a lifecycle standpoint when I'm creating and destroying things. How do I, govern those policies and those use cases? So, but also how do I execute it and consume it? And from an IT team's perspective, different IT teams may be responsible for different services, right? And that's very difficult in some automation tools, especially where the automation tool owner is one specific team, but other teams, it's a little bit difficult to scale and delegate ownership and permissions for creating the automation and managing that automation. So that now there's no real entry or deep expertise required, having to learn specific languages or having to, custom develop things from the team perspective. The policies are very low code, very easy to consume, very easy to manage and actually create. So those teams can be responsible for those policies and easily scale that. And then the third piece is how do you consume it? So once you have a policy, once you've created, expose those use cases of the different varying tool sets, and you've kind of limited, and you've got the attack surface down, you've got the a very small piece of what you want to expose to these different platforms. How do you consume that easily? And that's where we have a robust API where we've got plugins and providers. So for instance, with vRealize and Terraform, and are looking to create more all the time, but basically easy to consume these policies without having to do a lot of development work, and making it that surface and consumption area very small and tag based. So, and diving in a little bit deeper on what we mean by the abstraction layer. So take into account, or in a case, IPAM and DNS technology. So many things need IP addresses, or need registration with DNS. Sometimes that's not all in one solution for customers. Sometimes it may be across different vendors. So being able to separate those out into different policies, but also, how do you address this centrally without having to address the backend endpoint directly? So being able to change out the tools, like I'm managing this with vRealize, or I'm managing this with Terraform. But also, if I decide to change these backend technologies over time, if I decide to flip my endpoints and I do a migration from one vendor to another vendor, typically that would actually cause a lot of distress and disruption within my environment. All right, so I would have to, any place that I had a script that it was addressing those endpoints directly, any platform that was addressing those endpoints directly, I now got to go back through and change those scripts, update those, all those technology integration endpoints. So now something I built and provisioned, today, and then maybe 2 years in the future, migrate to a different technology, I can actually deprovision that and not have to worry about that disrupting my process, or even changing things from cloud management or an automation perspective. So I'm going to jump into the demo real quick and give you guys a little bit of a preview. Our first release is naming service. So basically lots of modular components coming out over time. But we're focusing on the first release here in a couple of weeks. You're gonna have the naming service introduced, and then quicker release schedule after that to bring in new technology integrations to bear. So let me show you. All right. So I'm gonna log into OneFuse. Okay, so where we're landing is just the main dashboard of the application. So I've got the naming service I want to jump into, and there's a couple of components that I'll go through. First of all, you'll notice there's managed names. So everything we do from the OneFuse platform, we actually track. So in any configuration that we put down, anything that's being created, you'll see that we're going to be tracking that, and I'll get into that in a little bit. From the naming module specifically, we've got 3 different components. We've got validators. So if I'm generating a name for a server, for instance, and it's going to be on my network, I want to have external validation to ensure that name is unique. So we have the ability to define various DNS validation, so internal and external DNS, which you would set up as an external endpoint and then tie into a validator. So there's that. There's the sequencing. So sequencing is how you guarantee that the name is going to be unique, and controlling the numbering schema. So that gets really detailed in terms of capabilities here. but suffice it to say that could be the 001 at the end of a server name, for an example, if it's a server name, or it could be at the beginning or the middle, or you could have several different sequences, but fine-grained control over that sequence definition and how we should actually be doing numbers. So I'll get into this in a little bit more deeper later. And then lastly is the naming policy itself. So the naming policy is what actually governs how the name gets generated. So the main section here is the naming template. So this is basically templating syntax on what sort of name that I want to create. What are the required parameters that go into this? And there's hundreds of operators and things that you can do here, but very simple. I'm showing some simple math just because. But we have variables that are parameters that come into this naming standard, for instance, environment, operating system, location. And you notice that I have a required flag here, right? So what required does for us is allows us through the template engine of the product to say, hey, if we don't see this parameter, because we're being executed from different platforms, but because there's many different myriad of ways to consume the technology, to enforce how things get called, not making a strict contract to be able to call the service, but allowing you the flexibility when you define your templates and the configurations within each of these policies that you can actually specify what's required or not. And if those required parameters are not fulfilled, then the request would fail, and that would trigger a failure in the upstream platform, so that basically you can't put a name in place or an IP in place or whatever it ends up being without those validations and those strict controls. So being able to do that directly within the templates is a pretty powerful feature. The other thing that we have that is another difficult thing if you didn't have this would be, how do I know what this is going to render, right? I would normally have to build a machine, or I'd have to go through the provisioning process, and I'd have to see what result I'm going to get back to be able to know, and then I'd have to come back in here and manipulate it. So throughout all of our policies and configurations, we have you'll see these little I button. So that allows you to preview what those naming templates are going to generate. And how I previewed this is a feature called static property sets. So I can create multiple scenarios that, basically, hey, what if I supplied these parameters, for production, for Windows, for Atlanta, but now I want to model something a little differently. So now I've got a Linux machine. You can see that Linux was reflected in the naming template preview. So this is a very simplistic example, but with vRealize and a lot of different platforms, there's a lot of parameters that actually get supplied with the calls from a payload standpoint, and basically just pasting those in and saving those for different builds that you have that, these are the ideal states of builds that you want to see, and being able to paste those properties in here and then see what that does with the various policies. So a couple of important things here. I'm not creating a policy for every scenario. I'm creating a one policy that can handle multiple scenarios because it is dynamic. Same thing for service management, IP management, config management. Any of these policies that we're going to release over time, is you want to have that flexibility and not have to have so many different configurations that you're managing. The other thing that's important to note here is the consumers of the technology don't need to know all this detail, right? They need to know the parameters, and that's about it. They don't need to know anything about sequencing, anything about validation, or any of these things to be able to call the service. So making that inflection point very, very slim and very small, and easy to consume, pretty much across all of our integrations. So the complexity would lie within the policy, not within the calling platform to have to configure and code against. So I'm going to jump into and do a couple of demos. I'm going to show vRealize automation consuming this naming policy that I've set up called VM naming standard. And then I'm going to show Terraform doing the same thing. Okay, so I'm going into Cloud Assembly, and I've got a blueprint I've configured here. And that blueprint has got a few inputs, right? Those same inputs that we need for our naming standard. And then from a resource perspective, it's a very simplistic thing. I've just got one machine I'm requesting, and I'm putting, the properties that I'm going to pass down that are going to come into the OneFuse API. But here's the real inflection point, right? This is the consumption point here. I've got, I'm telling it that I want to use OneFuse naming policy by just supplying a property or a tag. And two things. One is what connection am I using? So this is using, we have a dedicated vRealize 8 plugin as well as a vRealize 7 plugin. Now you could use the API and you could use ABX and other methods. But I'm just showcasing here, if you just want to do naming servers and you want something quick and easy, this is about as complicated as it gets. So OS, location, environment, I'm going to pass along. So let me deploy this blueprint. I'm going to use the current draft I'm in. And for this, I'm going to change the environment to test for this scenario, and hit deploy. So you can see the progress is going to be tracking here, and if I just toggle back, I think it doesn't really take long for it to actually get the name assigned. But jumping back into OneFuse, where this will show up in here in a second is going to be the managed names. So pretty much regardless of the tool you're using, whether you're coming in through the API or whether you're coming in directly from a provider, you'll see the name show up here, and then being able to track that back to a specific policy or a specific job, you can do right from the dashboard. So here's our name. So you can see we've generated demo 1 for test Linux, and you've got this is the first instance based on my sequence definition of this particular, these key variables I was tracking in my unique key in the sequence, and then the 001, appended on there. So the policy that it tracked to, as well as the job, so we can see the inputs that actually came in, the API call, the inputs that came in, from vRealize in this case, and this is where you can see some of the custom properties that were passed. And by the way, any of these properties are fair game from the template engine and from a naming standard or any policies perspective. And then the result that we gave back. So we gave demo test 4 and then 001. So if we jump back into Cloud Assembly and we look at the resource name, you'll see that that was the resource name that got generated. So similarly, if we want to do something from Terraform, so I've got sample configuration here that's just driving naming for simplicity's sake. So you could obviously use the names that are generated for any scenario to name any kind of attribute on any provider. I'm going to show it strictly with just the OneFuse provider. So we're going to look at the main Terraform configuration. So I'm basically saying I'm going to use Terraform Cloud for this demo. So that's the first little stanza. Here's my connection information back to the OneFuse appliance, and then the resource that I'm going to be creating. So basically, I'm referring to a particular naming policy. So if I look at my variables that I'm passing, We can see here that it's pretty straightforward. You know, here's my address, the policy ID that I'm calling, and then the properties that I'm going to pass. So I'm going to change for this example. I'm going to change it to test to make it the same as the other one. And now I'm going to do Terraform plan. So you can see that it's going to basically add one naming standard or generate a name using this policy ID and using these parameters. So that looks good. So we're going to apply that configuration. Confirming. All right, so we got a name back as we expected, the next one in the sequence. And I actually had the name, the DNS domain name on the policy. I could have supplied that from a parameter. I could have got it from a property. I could have made it dynamic in the policy, but just making it simple for this demo. It took 6 seconds here. So if I go back to on the OneFuse side, back to my naming dashboard, scroll down, I see that the last name came through is this 002, and it came from Terraform. And if I look into that, I can see the actual, you know, again, the API call, the inputs that were passed, and the result that was given back. Because I'm storing my state in Terraform Cloud, I can jump into to Terraform Cloud here and actually see this a similar result of what happened. So I've got a newer state. Click on that newer state. I can say I've got a new resource here, and you know, from a OneFuse naming standpoint, and here are the attributes that were used to generate it, and the ID that retracts back. So now my name is in the lifecycle of vRealize. It's in the lifecycle of Terraform. So when I destroy those resources, it's going to destroy those names and commit that name back, you know, to be available again. So simple demonstration, but you know, shows you know, how we're aiming to be the, you know, compatible from a lifecycle standpoint, from a consumption standpoint, making it very easy. And then it's, you know, sky's the limit in terms of use cases and scenarios that you want to drive from an automation standpoint. So with that, I'm going to jump back into, okay, this is great, but where would you use it and how is this applicable to me and the different scenarios that you have? All right, so if we look at what we provided for vRealize 7, we obviously had a variety of integrations and extensions. We're looking at the naming module in this case. What we did was we did validations, we did the blueprints and deployments, right, to be able to tag that in. But because of the way we operated, we were pretty rigid in terms of it's got to be this use case and scenario. So the guardrails were there, but the consumption was pretty low. It was just hey, name machines only, name deployments only, do it in context of vRealize, and we can't be embedded in custom workflows. We don't persist the names, so you can't see what was generated or, you know, do those things. You can still manage it in all those scenarios. What we're looking to do, or what the capability that we're providing out of the box in the very first release is a myriad of consumption scenarios, right? So we're going to have a dedicated plugin for both 7.6 and 8.1 that can be run side by side the existing vRealize 7 plugin from a compatibility standpoint. And basically we're able to not only name blueprints and deployments, right, and blueprints on vRealize 8, but we can be embedded into custom workflows. We can be embedded into from a cloud broker standpoint. So if you wanted to create naming as a service or IPAM as a service or DNS as a service, and abstract those backend resources and give somebody a form to be able to address those resources directly, you can do that pretty easily. Same with ABX, number of examples there. And then the other trend that we're seeing with Terraform is, what if I want to manage vRealize itself? I have to onboard new projects, business groups in the previous version, or and I've got a collection of cloud zones and deployment or catalog items and blueprints and things that every time I onboard these new scenarios, I've got to go and actually configure within vRealize itself. Well, how do I name my projects, my blueprints, my catalog items, my cloud zones, right? So naming those would have been, a by hand thing to figure out. So now with centralized naming, you can create naming policies for any of these scenarios. It's not just VMs, right? It's whatever the service that you're looking to automate, and then one place to track across deployments. And then the other thing this helps you with is, how do I get from 7 to 8 easier, right? How can I take those same naming standards that I was using and be able to address them in VRE 8? So that's something that you also get out of the box from OneFuse is once you define your policy in OneFuse, you can address that policy from a myriad of places, including using the same naming standard with the same parameters and everything without fear of conflict between VRA 7 and VRA 8 simultaneously. So this goes for any integration that we're going to come out with. Basically, all of them will be able to be addressed from both platforms simultaneously. So I'm going to jump in a little bit to how this helps Terraform, because we're seeing a lot more Terraform in the enterprise and customers adopting infrastructure as code scenarios and using Terraform for different not only managing the infrastructure but also managing the tools, as I mentioned before with vRealize. So some of the pain points that the customers are having with Terraform is, what happens when I duplicate my plan, right? And I've got a different scenario, I've got a different business group, I've got a different project, I've got a different deployment that I want to manage. Then every single time I need uniqueness within that, whatever I need to name, I have to go back and actually edit those by hand. So that causes disruption, and there's no real conflict resolution built in, no real easy way to generate those human readable names. So OneFuse allows this to be pretty simple from a Terraform standpoint. So I can simplify, I can drive it with parameters as I've shown you. I can utilize the sequencing that comes with the policy and all those policy features, and then I can drive those standards across multiple environments and clouds and deployments. And then it's stored in my Terraform state, so it doesn't matter if I have where my state exists or how many states I have. That's tracked not only in Terraform, but it's tracked back in a central place. So I don't have to worry about conflict between these different deployments. So some scenarios of Terraform and how that helps with VMware technologies. So not just vRealize, also vSphere, also NSX, also VCD, and some others that do have robust Terraform providers already. Is that being able to drive standardization in those Terraform plans across a wide variety of solutions and a wide variety of scenarios. So that all need to be uniquely sequenced, that all need human readable names. And then the last use case I'm going to go over from a Terraform perspective is what happens when I have multiple clouds, right? What if I'm consuming this, and same thing with vRealize, what if I'm consuming this across multiple scenarios and I want to maintain standards on how I name things? There's operational value in naming things in a certain way, and I want to make sure that those are consistent. Well, pretty easy to do, right? You would create your one standard for virtual machines, your one standard for load balancers, your one standard for containers, for instance, and then be able to consume those from Terraform in a singular way, or from vRealize in a singular way, so that you're not recreating the wheel on each type of scenario. So just a quick recap, we went through sequencing, We went through the templating and the validations, the independent centralized storage, the tracking and visibility. We looked at the dashboard and the jobs, and then we covered the naming policy, which brings all those pieces together. So to get started, basically you define your policy, you choose your automation tool, and then you configure that automation tool to be able to consume it, and away you go. So a couple of points before we get into the Q&A is what, from a OneFuse perspective, our aim is to try to reduce this the barriers so that you can get to 100% automation. I know it's a lofty goal, but you know, it's hard sometimes to get out of the way without having to create a lot of automation to or spin wheels to deduplicate things. So providing that modular configuration-based automation for those low-level components, complement and extend the existing tools, not necessarily replace them, not necessarily replace any of the platforms out there. But you know, being able to have that standardization, compliance, and then easy consumability and manageability across the board. And from a security compliance perspective, there's a few points here. Is you may want to limit who can create and execute the policies, and again, not having to give direct API access to these backend tools and systems to anybody that's using any tool, right? A lot of times we over allocate from a security perspective versus what's actually needed from a both from a separation concerns and from a least privilege perspective. So being able to have policies that are just there to provide a specific set of use cases and not necessarily expose the underlying API and services. And then lastly is the visibility. You know, a lot of times things are buried in script logs or under a particular VM deployment, or it's really tough to see it from the perspective of the endpoint that you're integrating to, or the policy that you use to create the configurations that actually dictate how you want it to happen. So looking at it from the policy perspective, looking at it from the endpoint perspective is another thing that we add to aid customers in both managing and troubleshooting. All right, Tracy, I'll flip it over to you. Tracy, we can't hear you if you're talking.
Thanks. Sorry about that. One last thing we wanted to draw your attention to before we dive into Q&A is our optimization assessment that we have available. As David alluded to earlier in the presentation, OneFuse can help customers move from 7 to 8. And so we have developed an optimization assessment that looks at 5 critical areas that make up 85% of the complexity and management overhead in vRealize 7 environments. So we wanted to make sure you guys were aware of this. There's no cost for this, and it's not a PS engagement. This is an automated tool. You download a VR workflow, you run it in your environment, we collect data, none of it is sensitive. It produces a text file as well as a JSON file. You upload the JSON file to us, we run it through some analysis on our side, and then we deliver a report to you that will give you a lot of valuable insight into your current environment as you plan your migration from 7 to 8. I also wanted to just draw your attention, we do have a advanced preview of OneFuse. So if you're interested in taking a look at OneFuse for yourself, there is a link at the bottom of the page to do that. So certainly visit our website if you're interested in either the assessment or getting an advanced look at OneFuse. All right, so let's jump into the questions. So when will OneFuse, hold on a second. When will OneFuse be available? Okay, so OneFuse, we are gonna be, it'll be generally available on July 17th, but as I mentioned just a second ago, We do have advanced previews available, so please visit our website at that link that was mentioned, and we will be sure to get in touch with you. Let's see. David, there's a question about which integrations are coming first.
Yeah, so which integration are coming first? So the first one we'll be naming. After that, we're looking at some of the core infrastructure services such as IPAM, DNS, Active Directory across a variety of vendors. So that's going to be our next focus, followed by service management and configuration management and integration scenarios.
Okay. Is the VR8 integration ABX or orchestrator based?
We have an orchestrator plugin, so it's VR8 plugin as well as a VR7 plugin, but that's not the only limit. That you can also invoke it from an ABX standpoint. There's really no limit because of the API integration from how you want to call it.
Okay. Will OneFuse have high availability architecture?
Yes, that's one of the things we're working on, is to make sure that you can have an HA configuration from a failover standpoint.
Okay. And there's a few questions in here about the slides. Yes, we will absolutely make sure that you guys have access to the slides. So we'll follow up after this presentation and make sure that everybody gets those. Another question, let's see. If you had to choose one attribute that makes you stand out from your competitors, where's your support located?
We have worldwide support. So, you know, from US to EMEA to Asia Pac. So we've got coverage across the globe.
Cool. And then couple of folks asked the same question. What's our relationship with VMware?
So on the VMware side, we've had a long-standing relationship, deep partnership with VMware. So technology partnership is still going strong. So you know, from a compatibility, from an API consumption, you know, VMware has several technology partners, and it's pretty good to work with from that side. So we obviously will keep that strong and keep continuing to work with VMware.
Okay, Sandeep, we got your question on licensing costs. Excuse me. So we'll be sure to follow up with you because we do have some advanced pricing available. So we'll have somebody follow up. And then finally, migration path. Migration, perhaps this is SovLabs customer existing. Is there a migration path for existing SovLabs customers?
Yes, as I mentioned, the policies can be addressed from both sides, and it can actually be configured even down to the blueprint level. So if you want to run it side by side, your existing SovLabs plugin, you can do that. If you want to test it out and try things out and move over just a blueprint at once, that's possible too. Or if you want to do whole hog, you know, move everything for the integration, that's possible. So it's kind of depends on you know, how fast you want to move. And once it's in OneFuse, though, once your policy that you want to address is in OneFuse, now you can consume it from anywhere. So you could theoretically be you know, at the same time, and it's designed to be used at the same time between vRealize versions. Same thing if you want to go between projects, if you want to go between tenants or orgs, if you want to use different instances of vRealize, and you know, we have customers with several instances, you know, and you know, the problem of how do you you know, coordinate those things between multiple instances sometimes gets difficult. So OneFuse is designed to solve those challenges.
Great. Is a SaaS offering on your roadmap?
Not currently, but we've always got an eye for that. Currently, it's an appliance-based model, and that appliance can be run on-prem it's basically Docker, and that can be run in, if you didn't want to run it in public cloud. So we do have images to be able to run it in public cloud, but that's not the focus of the first release. It's more OVA based on the first appliance release.
Great. Last question we have is, what systems integrators do you work with?
We work with several partners, so there's no real restriction there. I'd say from a focus standpoint, Ahead and WWT probably stand out the most, but it also depends on where you are in the world. Extrovert or there's other partners that are stronger in different regions as well.
Yeah, and Bob, we can always follow up on that question, because with the acquisition, we do have some more GSI relationships that came as a result of that. So I think that if anybody, does anybody have any other questions? No, I think that about wraps it up. Then thanks everybody for attending, and David, great presentation as always. Julie, we'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you both for taking the time to speak to us today. As a reminder to the audience, you will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link from today's webcast. To find out more about the VMUG webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the education page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation that will pop up as you exit the webcast, and let us know how today's session went. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you and have a great rest of your day.